The wind howled through the broken slats of the fence, carrying with it the scent of dust and dying sage. John Thorne stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun bleed red across the barren hills. The ranch stretched before him like a testament to loneliness. 40 acres of scrubland where even the cattle seemed to move with resigned weariness. No laughter had graced these grounds for 3 years. Not since Martha had drawn her last labored breath in the bedroom that now stood empty. Its door permanently closed. The house itself bore the weight of absence. Paint peeled from weathered boards, and the porch sagged slightly to the left, as if the structure itself mourned. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light that penetrated threadbare curtains. The kitchen, once filled with the aroma of fresh bread and preserves, now held only the bitter smell of coffee reheated too many times. Even the barn animals seemed subdued. The horses nickered softly, almost apologetically, and the chickens pecked at the ground with mechanical persistence. John moved through his evening routine with the precision of a man who had learned to fill silence with purpose. At 34, his face bore lines that spoke of sun and sorrow in equal measure. His hands, rough from years of working the land, trembled slightly as he opened the letter that had arrived that afternoon. He had written to the matrimonial agency 6 weeks prior, driven not by hope, but by his mother's failing health and her tearful pleas for help she was too proud to ask for directly. The response came from a woman named Delilah Moore. Her penmanship was careful, each letter formed with deliberate precision, as if she feared revealing too much in the curves and angles of her script. She wrote simply, "Mr. Thorne, I accept your proposal. I ask for nothing but honest work and a roof. I can tend house, cook, and care for the infirm. I will arrive on the 15th of May, if this suits you. Respectfully, Miss D. Moore." 500 miles east. Delilah Moore sat in the parlor of her sister's home, enduring the whispers that followed her like shadows. The women at church moved their children away when she approached, and the men looked through her as if she were glass. Barren. They called her when they thought she couldn't hear. Poor Charles, saddled with a mule for 5 years. Her former husband had returned her to her family like defective merchandise, the divorce papers citing her inability to provide heirs as grounds for dissolution. At 28, Delilah had learned to wear shame like armor, each cruel word adding another layer until she could barely feel anything beneath. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed like divine providence, a chance to disappear into the vastness of the frontier where her past might not follow. She packed her few belongings with methodical care: 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, a silver brush, and the wedding ring she couldn't bring herself to sell despite everything. The journey west was a descent into another world. The train curved through mountains that rose like ancient titans, their peaks snow-capped even in late spring. Beyond the windows, civilization gradually surrendered to wilderness. Towns became trading posts, then isolated cabins, then nothing but endless expanses of red rock and stubborn vegetation. At night, wolves howled in the distance, their calls echoing off canyon walls. Delilah found odd comfort in their wildness. Here was honesty without pretense, survival without apology. The stagecoach from the rail station to John's ranch took 2 days, lurching over roads that were little more than suggestions carved into the earth. The driver, a grizzled man who chewed tobacco with religious dedication, spoke only once. "Thorne Place is the last stop. Nothing beyond but Apache territory and buzzards." Delilah clutched her carpetbag and said nothing, watching the landscape transform into something lunar in its desolation. When the ranch finally came into view, it looked like a thumbprint pressed into the vastness, small, defiant, achingly alone. John stood waiting by the gate, hat in hand, his face unreadable as carved stone. He was taller than she had imagined, broader too, with shoulders that suggested a lifetime of carrying burdens, both physical and otherwise. When their eyes met, she saw not cruelty, but something worse, emptiness, as if he had already decided she would disappoint him. "Miss Moore," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Welcome to, well, welcome." He gestured vaguely at the property, seeming to realize mid-sentence that there was nothing particularly welcoming about it. The house squatted behind him like a wounded animal, and somewhere a loose shutter banged against wood in an irregular rhythm. Agnes Thorne watched from the kitchen window, her gnarled hands gripping the windowsill. At 71, she had outlived 2 husbands and 3 of her 4 children. John was all that remained, and she had watched him fold into himself after Martha's death like a letter being sealed forever. This new woman was pretty enough, she supposed, though prettiness had never put food on tables or mended broken hearts. Agnes noted the way the girl, for she seemed barely more than that, held herself with practiced dignity, spine straight despite the weariness that shadowed her features. The wedding took place at sunset 3 days later, performed by a circuit preacher who smelled of whiskey and righteousness in equal measure. John had cleaned himself up, his Sunday suit hanging loose on a frame that had forgotten the comfort of regular meals. Delilah wore her traveling dress, having sold her wedding gown years ago to pay for medicine during her mother's final illness. They stood in the parlor, the only witnesses being Agnes and the ranch hand, Miguel, who shifted uncomfortably in boots that had never seen the inside of a house. "Do you, John Thorne, take this woman?" The preacher's words fell like stones into still water. John's "I do" came out cracked, as if the phrase itself was foreign to his tongue. Delilah's response was steadier, though she kept her eyes fixed on a point just beyond John's shoulder where a crack in the wall resembled a river on a map. When instructed to kiss his bride, John leaned forward with the enthusiasm of a man approaching the gallows. His lips barely brushed hers, dry and brief as a contract being signed. Delilah had not expected passion, but the mechanical nature of it still stung. She had been kissed with disappointment before, with frustration and even anger, but never with such profound indifference. The sun died behind the mountains as they signed the marriage certificate, and nobody smiled. Agnes served a supper of beans and cornbread that might have been a funeral meal for all the conversation it inspired. Miguel excused himself early, and the preacher followed soon after, leaving the newlyweds alone with Agnes, who retired to her room with pointed silence. John and Delilah sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the space between them vast as the prairie outside. Finally, John spoke. "Your room is at the end of the hall. Was Martha's? I've moved my things to the small room by the stairs." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I rise at dawn. Coffee's made by 4:30. Alone in the darkness of Martha's room, her room now, Delilah unpacked by candlelight. The space still held the ghost of another woman, a forgotten hairpin under the dresser, the faint scent of lavender in the wardrobe. She placed her mother's Bible on the nightstand and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Somewhere in the house, she heard John's footsteps pacing, then stopping, then silence thick as winter snow. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the wasteland, and the wind tested every board and nail of the house. Delilah Moore Thorne, for that was her name now, lay in a dead woman's bed and wondered if she had simply traded one form of barrenness for another. The moon rose over the ranch, illuminating nothing but earth that had forgotten how to yield and hearts that had forgotten how to hope. The first weeks passed like seasons in purgatory, each day bleeding into the next with monotonous precision. Delilah rose before dawn, her body adjusting to the ranch's rhythms with the resignation of a clock being wound. The kitchen became her domain by necessity. John disappeared into the fields before she could offer more than a mumbled greeting, and Agnes watched her every movement with hawk-like scrutiny. The stove fought her at every turn, belching smoke when she needed heat and dying to embers when she needed flame. Her first attempts at biscuits emerged like stones, and the coffee she brewed could have stripped paint. John ate without comment, his jaw working mechanically, while Agnes pushed food around her plate with theatrical suffering. But Delilah had endured worse humiliations than failed bread. She studied the peculiarities of the ancient stove like a scientist, adjusted recipes for the altitude, and learned to read the wood's mood by the color of its smoke. By the 3rd week, her biscuits rose properly, golden and light. Agnes took one bite, paused, then took another. "Passable," she declared. which Delilah understood to be high praise. John said nothing, but she noticed he took seconds. The house revealed its needs slowly, like a patient afraid to admit pain. Delilah discovered gaps in the walls where wind whistled through, floorboards that groaned warnings before threatening to give way, and windows so caked with grime they filtered daylight into perpetual dusk. She attacked each problem methodically, her soft hands blistering, then callousing, as she learned the peculiar intimacy of maintaining a home that fought against comfort. Agnes observed these efforts from her chair by the fireplace, offering criticism disguised as advice. "Martha used to oil that hinge with bacon grease," she would say, or "no point in washing windows before dust season ends." But Delilah noticed the old woman's breathing came easier when the drafts were sealed, and her complaints grew softer when fresh flowers appeared on the kitchen table. Scraggly wildflowers that bloomed despite the odds. The ranch work was another education entirely. John communicated in gestures and grunts, pointing to tasks that needed doing without explanation. Delilah learned by observation and error. The chickens, she discovered, were vindictive creatures who pecked at her ankles until she learned to scatter feed with authority. The milk cow, Bessie, tested her patience by kicking over the pail until Delilah learned the exact pressure and rhythm that earned cooperation. One afternoon, while hauling water from the well, her grip faltered. The full bucket tilted dangerously, and she stumbled, certain she would sprawl in the dirt with another dress ruined. But strong hands caught the rope alongside hers, steadying the load. John had appeared silently, as he often did, moving with the peculiar grace of a man who had learned to navigate his world without disturbing it. For a moment, they stood frozen, both gripping the rope, close enough that she could smell the mixture of sweat, leather, and tobacco that clung to him. Their eyes met properly for the first time since the wedding. His were the color of winter sky, not the romantic blue of poetry, but the washed-out gray that preceded storms. Something flickered in them, quick as heat lightning, before he stepped back. "Smaller loads," he said gruffly. "No shame in making 2 trips instead of 1. That night, Delilah found a new bucket by the well, smaller and lighter, with a rope that didn't bite into palms. She never saw John place it there, but she knew. The horses became her unexpected solace. Unlike the chickens' hostility or Bessie's measured tolerance, the horses seemed to recognize something in her that she'd forgotten existed. The mare, Rosie, would nicker softly when Delilah approached, pressing her velvet nose into offered palms. The foals, born that spring, followed her with the trust of creatures who had not yet learned disappointment. One evening, Agnes found her in the paddock, laughing as a colt attempted to eat her apron strings. It was a sound that seemed to surprise them both, bright and genuine, cracking through the air like ice breaking on a frozen pond. Agnes said nothing, but that night she asked Delilah to help with her knitting, claiming her eyes weren't what they used to be. They sat together by lamplight, needles clicking in companionable rhythm. John witnessed the laugh too, though neither woman knew. He had been returning from mending fences, bone-tired and covered in dust, when the sound stopped him mid-stride. He stood in the shadow of the barn, watching his wife play with the colts, her face transformed by joy into something that made his chest constrict painfully. He had forgotten that sound, not just laughter, but the careless happiness that prompted it. Martha had laughed, before the sickness, before the blood and the prayers that went unanswered. He turned away, disturbed by the comparison and the guilt that followed it. But that night, he found himself watching Delilah across the supper table, noticing things he had trained himself to ignore, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on cutting meat, how her hair, severely pinned during the day, escaped in small wisps by evening, framing her face in soft defiance, the grace in her movements, economy born not of ranch life but of years spent making herself smaller, less noticeable, less of a burden. Delilah felt his gaze but didn't acknowledge it. She had learned to distinguish between types of male attention, the leering, the pitying, the dismissive. This was something else, uncertain and almost fearful, as if he were seeing something he didn't want to recognize. She kept her eyes on her plate and spoke only when Agnes asked direct questions. The routine of days began to shift in small ways. John started leaving morning coffee poured for her, still steaming when she entered the kitchen. Delilah began packing extra biscuits in his lunch pail, adding preserves she had found buried in the pantry and restored to edibility. Neither acknowledged these small kindnesses, but they accumulated like snow, silent and steady. One morning, Delilah discovered Agnes struggling to rise from bed, her joints swollen with rheumatism. Without fuss, she helped the older woman dress, prepared a basin of hot water for soaking, and brought breakfast on a tray. Agnes submitted to these ministrations with poor grace, muttering about being treated like an invalid. But her protests lacked conviction. "You're not what I expected," Agnes said suddenly, as Delilah massaged liniment into her swollen hands. "What did you expect?" Delilah asked, keeping her voice neutral. Agnes was quiet for so long that Delilah thought she wouldn't answer. Then, someone harder, or weaker, not. She gestured vaguely. Not someone who knows how to be kind without making a show of it. That evening, John found his mother and wife sitting together on the porch, Agnes teaching Delilah to darn socks. The domestic scene hit him like a physical blow. So normal and yet so foreign after years of masculine silence. He almost retreated, but Agnes called out, "Don't stand there like a scarecrow. These are your socks we're fixing." He sat on the steps, far enough away to maintain distance but close enough to be included. The sunset painted the desert in shades of amber and rose, and for the first time in 3 years, the ranch felt less like a grave and more like a home waiting to remember itself. Delilah glanced at him, then away, her fingers never pausing in their work. But a small smile played at the corners of her mouth, and John found himself wondering what it would take to see it bloom fully, to hear that laugh again, to discover if hope could take root in ground that had known too much sorrow. The stars emerged one by one, and they sat in silence that was, for once, not empty but full of possibility. The storm arrived without warning, as sudden and violent as everything else in this unforgiving land. Lightning split the sky like God's own fury, and rain hammered the roof with such force that conversation became impossible. Delilah woke to water dripping steadily onto her quilt, then rushing in streams as the ancient roof surrendered to the assault. "John!" she called out, grabbing what she could to catch the water, wash basins, pots, even the good china that had belonged to Martha. The house groaned under the wind's assault, and somewhere in the darkness, glass shattered. John appeared in her doorway, hair wild from sleep, wearing only his union suit and boots hastily pulled on. For a moment, they stared at each other in the lightning's stark illumination, both aware of the impropriety, and both beyond caring. Then another section of roof gave way, and they moved as one. They worked through the night, racing from room to room, dragging furniture away from the worst leaks, catching water wherever possible. Agnes, confined to her bed by swollen joints, could only call out directions and fret. At some point, Delilah's nightgown became so soaked it clung to her like a second skin. She saw John deliberately turn away, but not before she caught something raw and hungry in his expression. By dawn, the storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a house that looked like it had barely survived a siege. They stood in the kitchen surrounded by buckets and pans filled with murky water, both drenched and shivering. Delilah's hair hung in wet ropes down her back, and John's union suit left little to imagination. The absurdity of it struck her first. A laugh bubbled up, inappropriate and unstoppable. "We look like drowned rats," she gasped between giggles. John stared at her, then at himself, and something cracked in his stern facade. His laugh, when it came, was rusty from disuse but genuine. They laughed until their sides hurt, until tears mixed with rainwater on their cheeks, until the laughter transformed into something else, an awareness that filled the space between them like electricity before a storm. "You should." John gestured vaguely toward her soaked state. "That is, You'll catch cold." "Yes," she agreed, but neither moved. The sunrise filtered through the kitchen window, painting everything golden, and in that light, she saw him not as her distant husband, but as a man, vulnerable, yearning, achingly alone. That evening, after the worst damage had been assessed and temporary repairs made, they sat by the fire Agnes had insisted on despite the season. The old woman had retired early, worn out by worry and helplessness. John poured whiskey. Medicinal, he claimed, and they drank in silence until the warmth loosened more than just their chilled bones. "Tell me," John said suddenly, "about before." Delilah understood. She had been waiting for this question since her arrival, dreading it. But now it seemed necessary, a splinter that needed drawing out before healing could begin. "Charles was—" She searched for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. "He was what my father chose. A good match, everyone said, solid prospects, came from a respectable family. I was 19 and grateful anyone wanted me at all. Plain girls from poor families don't get many chances." "You're not plain," John said roughly, then seemed surprised by his own words. Delilah smiled sadly. "Kind lies don't help. John, I know what I am. But Charles didn't marry me for beauty. He needed a wife to run his household, give him sons to carry on his name. For 3 years. She paused, took another sip of whiskey. "I tried everything. Saw doctors who prodded and proclaimed me fit. Tried every old wives' remedy, herbs, prayers, sleeping with fertility charms under my pillow." Charles grew colder with each month that passed without quickening. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. John remained silent, but she felt his attention like a physical weight. "The final year was the worst. He wouldn't—" She colored, even now unable to speak frankly of marital intimacies. "He said there was no point in plowing barren ground. Took up with the banker's daughter instead. Everyone knew, but they blamed me. A man has needs. They said a true wife would give him children. That's not—" John started, then stopped, his jaw working. "The divorce papers were delivered on my 24th birthday," Delilah continued, needing to finish now that she'd started. "He'd already arranged everything. Sent me back to my family like returned goods. My sister took me in, but I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at her own children, relief that she wasn't me, fear that my failure might be catching." She expected platitudes or awkward silence. Instead, John refilled both their glasses and stared into the fire. "Martha bled to death," he said abruptly. "The baby, too. Doctor said the child was turned wrong, got stuck. Took 2 days of laboring before—" He drained his glass. "I should have taken her to town sooner. Should have paid for the better doctor. Should have done something different." "It wasn't your fault," Delilah said softly. "Wasn't it?" His voice was harsh with self-loathing. "I put that baby in her. I watched her grow weaker with each passing month and told myself it was natural, that women were made for this. I prayed while she screamed. Prayed right up until she stopped screaming. And then the silence was worse than anything. They sat with their shared sorrows laid bare between them. 2 people marked by different griefs that had led them to the same desolate place. "I didn't want another wife," John admitted. "Mother needed help, and I needed someone who wouldn't expect things I couldn't give. Love, children, hope." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "I'm sorry. You deserve better than a broken-down rancher hiding from ghosts." "We're all broken," Delilah replied. "Some of us just hide it better." Without conscious thought, they had moved closer during their confessions. Now they sat near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the whiskey on his breath mixed with leather and smoke. The space between them hummed with possibility. "Delilah?" He said her name like a prayer or a curse. She couldn't tell which. She turned toward him, and suddenly his mouth was on hers, not the dry, contractual kiss of their wedding, but something desperate and alive. His hands tangled in her still damp hair, and she made a sound that might have been sob or surrender. They kissed like drowning people gasping for air, all the loneliness and need of their separate sorrows pouring into this moment of connection. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, John's eyes were wide with something like fear. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Don't!" Delilah stopped him. "Don't apologize. Not for this." He studied her face, searching for regret or obligation, finding neither. Slowly, carefully, as if she might spook like an unbroken horse, he cupped her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, and she leaned into the touch, starved for gentleness after so long. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be a husband again. How to—" He gestured helplessly. "Then don't be a husband," she said. "Just be John, and let me be Delilah. Not the barren woman, not the mail-order bride, not the replacement. Just us." He kissed her again, softer this time, tentative. She could taste his uncertainty, his fear, but underneath it something else. A warming. Like earth remembering spring. They moved together to his room, her hand in his, both trembling with more than cold. What happened next was neither passionate nor practiced. It was two damaged people relearning touch, rediscovering that bodies could bring comfort instead of disappointment. John was gentle to the point of reverence, as if afraid she might shatter. Delilah guided his hands, showing him she was stronger than porcelain. They came together with careful wonder, each touch a question, each response a small act of faith. Afterward, they lay entwined in the narrow bed, listening to rain begin again, gentler this time, a benediction rather than an assault. Delilah traced the scars on his hands, the evidence of years wrestling with this unforgiving land. He pressed his lips to her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe not knowing means there's room for something new." Outside, the desert drank in the rain. Seeds, long dormant, stirring with impossible hope. Inside, two people who had forgotten how to hope held each other through the night, learning that sometimes the greatest courage was not in facing storms alone, but in admitting you no longer wanted to. The change came gradually, like desert flowers blooming after rare rain. John still rose before dawn, but now he lingered over coffee, watching Delilah move about the kitchen with newfound ease. She had learned the rhythms of the ranch, when to start bread so it would be fresh for supper, how to read the sky for weather, which chickens laid in hidden nests. Her movements had gained confidence, and sometimes she hummed while she worked, old hymns half-remembered from childhood. Agnes noticed first. "Of course. You're making a fool of yourself," she told John one morning when Delilah had gone to gather eggs. Mooning after her like a schoolboy. "I'm not mooning," John protested, but his ears reddened. "Good," Agnes said tartly, "because that girl deserves more than mooning. She deserves a proper husband." The words stung because they were true. Since that night of the storm, John had been caught between desire and fear. He wanted to reach for Delilah, but didn't trust his own hands not to bring ruin. They shared a bed now, but tentatively, as if too much happiness might alert fate to their presumption. Delilah felt the change too. Laughter came easier, not just the polite social kind, but real mirth that bubbled up from somewhere deep. When John taught her to shoot, standing behind her to adjust her stance, she leaned back into his solid warmth and felt safe. When she made her first clean shot, hitting the tin can square center, he whooped and swung her around in a circle, both of them giddy with her success. Even Agnes softened, sharing stories of her younger days, teaching Delilah the medicinal uses of desert plants, passing down knowledge like inheritance. The three of them formed an unlikely family, bound not by blood but by choice and growing affection. Then came the Sunday that shattered their fragile peace. They had ventured into town for supplies and church, John's first appearance at Sunday service since Martha's funeral. Delilah wore her best dress, pressed and mended, while John had trimmed his beard and dusted off his good hat. Agnes, joints permitting, had insisted on coming too. The congregation's curiosity was palpable as they entered. Whispers followed their progress to a back pew, and Delilah kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her spine rigid with practiced dignity. The service itself passed without incident, Reverend Blake preaching about forgiveness while his wife played hymns on an out-of-tune piano. It was afterward, during the social hour, that the assault began. "So you're the new Mrs. Thorne," said Constance Weatherby, the minister's wife, her smile sharp as broken glass. "We've heard so much about you." "All good things, I hope," Delilah replied carefully. "Oh, certainly, though we were surprised John remarried so quickly, and to a divorced woman." The last words dripped with false sympathy. Other women gathered like carrion birds, their questions dressed as concern. Had she been married long before? Such a shame about the lack of children. How fortunate that John didn't mind damaged goods. Delilah endured it all, her smile fixed, her responses polite. But when Margaret Collins loudly wondered whether barren women carry some sort of curse, John's patience snapped. "That's enough." His voice cut through the chatter like a blade. "My wife has shown you nothing but courtesy, which is more than you deserve. Now, John," Reverend Blake intervened, "the ladies mean no harm, don't they?" John's eyes were hard as flint. "Then perhaps they should concern themselves with their own families instead of gossiping about mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Constance Weatherby drew herself up, offended. "Well, I never—" "No," John agreed. You never worked a day in your life. Never went hungry. Never had to make choices that broke your heart. Never had to start over with nothing but hope and grit. So maybe you should never judge those who have." He took Delilah's arm, gentle despite his anger. "We're leaving." Agnes cackled as they helped her into the wagon. "That was better than a traveling show. Did you see Constance's face, like she'd swallowed a lemon whole?" But Delilah was quiet on the ride home, and John could feel her withdrawing, pulling back into the shell she'd begun to abandon. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I've brought shame to your name." John pulled the horses to a stop right there in the middle of the road. "Now you listen to me. Delilah Moore Thorne. The only shame in that church was theirs. You're worth 10 of those dried-up biddies." "They're right, though," she whispered. "I am damaged. Barren? A poor bargain." "Stop." He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You're my wife, my choice, my—" He struggled for words. "My blessing, and anyone who says otherwise can go straight to hell." Agnes reached forward to pat Delilah's shoulder. "For what it's worth, dear, I've lived long enough to know that the fruit that comes easiest isn't always the sweetest. Some ground needs time and tending before it yields its harvest." That night, John loved his wife with a fierceness that bordered on desperation, as if he could chase away the town's cruelty with tenderness. Delilah clung to him, letting his certainty shore up her wavering faith, but the damage was done. Over the following weeks, Delilah found reasons to avoid town. When the church ladies organized a quilting bee, she declined. When the general store offered her credit, she insisted on paying cash, limiting their interactions to bare necessity. She smiled less, laughed rarely, and John could see her retreating into the careful, guarded woman who had first arrived at his ranch. The final blow came when she discovered a note tucked into their supply order. Proverbs 30:16. The barren womb is never satisfied. No signature was needed. The handwriting was Constance Weatherby's. John found Delilah crying in the barn. The note crumpled in her fist. He'd seen her endure disappointment, hard work, and loneliness. But he'd never seen her weep like this, silent, hopeless tears that seemed to come from some bottomless well of sorrow. "I can't do this," she sobbed. "I can't be the reason you're ostracized. You deserve a real wife, children, a future." "Stop." He knelt beside her in the straw, pulling her against him. "You are my real wife. You are my future." "But, no." His voice was fierce. "I've lived with ghosts for 3 years. You brought me back to life. You think I care what those hypocrites say? You think their approval matters more than seeing you smile, than hearing you laugh, than watching you gentle a spooked horse or coax Agnes into taking her medicine. She looked up at him through tear-swollen eyes. What if they're right? What if I am cursed? Then I'll be cursed right alongside you, he said simply, because a life with you, even if it's hard, even if the whole town turns against us, is better than a life without you. John, I love you. The words came out raw, surprising them both. I didn't want to, tried not to, but you snuck up on me like sunrise, and now I can't imagine the dark anymore. She kissed him then, salty with tears but sweet with promise. I love you too. Despite everything, because of everything, I love you. They held each other in the dusty barn while the horses nickered softly and the sun slanted through the boards. Outside, the world waited with its judgments and cruelties. But inside, two people who had thought themselves beyond love discovered that sometimes the heart's most stubborn ground could yield the most unexpected harvest. Agnes found them there an hour later, still entwined, and for once held her sharp tongue. Instead, she simply said, "Supper's ready," and hobbled back to the house, hiding her smile. That night, they ate together as a family, the windows glowing with lamplight that pushed back the darkness. And if the rest of the world wanted to whisper and judge, well, let them. The Thorn Ranch had remembered joy, and that was worth any amount of gossip. The drought arrived like a biblical plague, settling over the land with malevolent patience. Week after week passed without a cloud, the sky a merciless blue dome that mocked their increasingly desperate prayers. The grass turned brittle as old paper, crumbling under the cattle's hooves. The garden Delilah had coaxed to life withered despite her careful watering. Each bucket hauled from the diminishing well, a futile gesture against nature's indifference. John watched the water level drop with growing dread. He'd survived droughts before, but never with so much at stake. The previous year's losses had left them with no financial cushion. And now, with 3 mouths to feed and Agnes requiring medicine for her worsening condition, every day brought them closer to ruin. The cattle grew gaunt, their eyes dull with thirst. John was forced to sell half the herd at a loss, keeping only the strongest breeding stock, even Rosie, Delilah's favorite mare, moved listlessly in the paddock, her coat dusty and dull. The ranch that had begun to bloom under Delilah's care now seemed to shrivel back into itself, as if the land itself had decided to reclaim its desolation. Delilah watched John age years in weeks. Lines carved themselves deeper around his eyes, and his shoulders bent under invisible weight. He'd leave before dawn to dig new wells, returning after dark covered in dirt and defeat. She'd wash the dust from his face and hands, neither speaking of the fear that gnawed at them like hunger. "We'll manage," became their mutual lie, repeated like a prayer that had lost its power. The town, suffering its own deprivations, offered no relief. Credit at the general store dried up faster than the wells. The bank manager, a weasel-faced man named Garrett, made it clear that extensions on loan payments would come with conditions, his eyes lingering on Delilah in a way that made her skin crawl. One evening, as they sat down to another meager meal of beans and cornbread, Delilah made a decision. "I have something," she said quietly, rising from the table. She returned with a small velvet pouch, spilling its contents onto the scarred wood. A gold locket, a pair of pearl earrings, and a ruby ring caught the lamplight, the last remnants of her former life. "No," John said immediately. "Those are yours. They're ours," she corrected. "And they're doing no good sitting in a drawer." "Delilah, don't." Her voice was firm. "Don't make this about pride. We need money for food, for Agnes's medicine, for seed when the rains finally come. These pretty things won't fill our stomachs or ease her pain." Agnes, who had been silent, spoke up. "The girl's right. I sold my wedding ring during the war to buy food for my babies. Sentiment's a luxury for folks who aren't hungry." John stared at the jewelry, his jaw working. Delilah could see the war in him, masculine pride battling practical necessity. Finally. He pushed back from the table and strode out without a word. They heard him in the barn, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood with unnecessary violence. "He'll come around," Agnes said. "Men need time to swallow their pride. Goes down harder than whiskey." But when Delilah woke the next morning, the jewelry was gone from the table. In its place lay a note in John's careful script. "Went to Carson City. Back in 3 days. Keep the rifle loaded." Beside the note sat his father's pocket watch, the one item he'd sworn never to sell. Delilah picked up the watch, feeling its weight. He'd left it so she'd know he wasn't selling her things without sacrificing his own. She pressed it to her lips, then tucked it safely away. He'd have it back. She vowed, when this cursed drought ended, those 3 days stretched like weeks. Delilah and Agnes rationed water carefully, drinking only what was necessary, saving the rest for the animals. The sun beat down relentlessly, and dust devils danced across the barren fields like mocking spirits. On the second night, fever struck. Agnes woke delirious, her skin burning, calling for children long dead. Delilah recognized the signs. The same fever had swept through her hometown years before, taking the weak and elderly first. Without proper medicine, without enough water to cool the fever, Agnes would die. Delilah didn't hesitate. She hitched Rosie to the wagon, loaded Agnes onto a makeshift bed of quilts, and set out for town in the dead of night. The journey took 4 hours under normal conditions. She made it in 3, pushing the mare beyond endurance. Dr. Morrison answered his door bleary-eyed and irritated until he saw Agnes. His expression shifted to professional concern. "Fever's bad. She needs laudanum, willow bark, and constant cooling. Can you pay?" "My husband will settle the account when he returns," Delilah said, lifting her chin. The doctor hesitated. The drought had made everyone cautious about credit. Then he looked at Delilah, dust-covered, exhausted, but fierce with determination, and nodded. "See that he does." For 2 days and nights, Delilah didn't leave Agnes's side. She bathed the old woman with precious water, spooned medicine between cracked lips, and talked constantly about anything, everything, nonsense and memories alike, believing that her voice could anchor Agnes to life. "Stubborn old bird," she whispered, watching Agnes fight for each breath. "You don't get to leave us yet. John needs you. I need you. Who else will tell me when I'm being foolish? Who'll teach me to make proper biscuits?" On the 3rd dawn, Agnes's fever broke. She opened clear eyes and croaked, "My biscuits were never that good anyway." Delilah sobbed with relief. Clutching the old woman's gnarled hand, John returned to find them like that. Delilah asleep in the chair beside Agnes's bed, their hands still linked. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, but his saddlebags bulked with supplies. He'd gotten more for the jewelry than expected and added the watch money to it, enough to see them through another month, maybe 2 if they were careful. But seeing his mother alive, seeing his wife's exhausted devotion, he realized he'd sold the wrong things. What good was pride when love required sacrifice? What use was jewelry when life hung by such a slender thread? "Water?" he asked softly, not wanting to wake them. "Almost gone," Delilah murmured, stirring. Her eyes opened, found his. "You're back." "I'm back." He crossed to her, kissed her forehead, tasted salt and dust and determination. "How is she?" "Fighting, like all the Thorns. Too stubborn to quit. Like all the Thorns," he repeated, including her in that declaration. That night, clouds gathered on the horizon, not enough for rain, but enough for hope. They sat on the porch, all 3 of them, Agnes propped between them wrapped in quilts despite the heat. The old woman dozed, worn out from her battle with death. John and Delilah held hands over her head, watching the sky. "I'm sorry," John said, "for leaving you to handle this alone." "You did what needed doing." Delilah replied, "As did I. That's what family does." He squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses that matched his own now. "When the rains come, and they will come, I want to plant something new, not just crops. Maybe it's time to think about the future differently." She understood what he wasn't quite saying. The future comes as it will. For now, We're here. We're alive. That's enough. But that night, lying in their narrow bed while the first tentative drops of rain began to fall, Delilah felt a flutter in her belly that might have been hope or might have been something more. She said nothing. Too many disappointments had taught her caution. But she pressed John's hand to her stomach and felt him pull her closer, as if he could protect her from all the world's cruelties through proximity alone. Outside, the rain grew stronger, and the earth began to drink. The attack came on a Tuesday, ordinary as any other until it wasn't. John had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Delilah to manage the ranch with Miguel, their hired hand. She was in the garden, coaxing life back into the soil now that the rains had returned. When she heard the commotion, horses, too many and moving too fast. 3 men materialized from the dust cloud like demons from a fever dream. Their leader, a gap-toothed man with cruel eyes, dismounted with practiced ease while his companions flanked the house. Delilah's blood turned cold, but her hands remained steady as she gripped the hoe. "Afternoon, ma'am," the leader said, his politeness a mockery. "Looking for John Thorne. Heard he might have come into some money recently." "He's not here," Delilah replied, calculating distances to the house, to the rifle, to anywhere safe. Shame. The man's smile revealed more gaps than teeth. "Guess we'll wait." "You can keep us company." Miguel emerged from the barn, saw the situation, and started forward. One of the riders clubbed him down before he'd taken 3 steps. The sound of impact made Delilah's stomach lurch, but she forced herself to remain still. Calm, thinking. "No need for violence," she said, pitching her voice steady. "There's coffee on the stove. You're welcome to wait peacefully." The leader laughed. "Hear that, boys? The lady's offering hospitality." They herded her inside, one man staying with the unconscious Miguel, another positioning himself by the window. Agnes, thank God, was napping in her room. Delilah moved mechanically, setting out cups, pouring coffee, her mind racing. The rifle was in the bedroom. Useless. But the kitchen knife was within reach, and John had taught her more than just shooting. "Your man sold some pretty jewelry in Carson City," the leader said conversationally. "Word travels. Drought's been hard on everyone, but seems the Thorns found themselves a treasure. We sold family heirlooms to buy food." Delilah replied, "There's nothing left." "Now, that's hard to believe." He stood, moving closer. "Maybe we should look around, or maybe—" His hand reached for her face. "Maybe you've got other ways to pay." The moment his fingers touched her cheek, Delilah moved. The coffee pot connected with his skull with a satisfying crack. Hot liquid splashed across his face as he screamed, and she was already reaching for the knife when the door exploded inward. John stood framed in the doorway like an avenging angel, rifle raised. He'd heard the commotion from the road, left the wagon, and come at a dead run. The man by the window turned, raising his pistol, and John shot him without hesitation. The sound in the small kitchen was deafening. The scalded leader fumbled for his gun, half blind from coffee and blood. Delilah didn't give him the chance. The kitchen knife found his gun hand, and he dropped the weapon with a howl. John crossed the room in 2 strides, rifle butt connecting with the man's temple, dropping him beside his companion. "The barn!" Delilah gasped. "Miguel!" But the third man was already fleeing, spurring his horse desperately across the desert. John raised his rifle, then lowered it. "Let him run. He'll spread the word. The Thorne Ranch isn't easy pickings." They found Miguel conscious but dazed, a goose egg rising on his skull. While Delilah tended him, John tied up the 2 thieves. The one he'd shot was only wounded. The bullet caught in his shoulder. The leader moaned semi-consciously, coffee burns already blistering across his face. "Should have killed them," Agnes said from the doorway, having woken to gunfire. She looked pale but steady, her late husband's pistol in her gnarled hands. "Maybe," John agreed. "But Delilah's right. We're better than that." They waited for the sheriff, who arrived near sunset with a deputy. He took in the scene, the wounded outlaws, Delilah's torn dress, Miguel's injury. and nodded grimly. McAllister gang, he identified. Been hitting ranches across 3 counties. This is the first time anyone's fought them off. He looked at Delilah with new respect. That was quick thinking with the coffee pot, ma'am. My wife's full of surprises, John said, and the pride in his voice warmed her more than whiskey. After the sheriff left with his prisoners, they sat around the kitchen table, all 4 of them, including Miguel, whose loyalty had earned him family status. The room still smelled of gunpowder and spilled coffee, but also of survival, of home defended. I froze, Delilah admitted quietly. When I saw them, I couldn't move at first. But you didn't stay frozen, John pointed out. That's what matters. You protected our home. Our home, she repeated, tasting the words like wine. That night, after Miguel had retired to his quarters and Agnes to her bed, John and Delilah lay entwined, both still trembling from the day's violence. He traced the bruise forming on her wrist where the leader had grabbed her, his touch infinitely gentle. I could have lost you, he whispered. But you didn't. She turned in his arms, pressing her palm to his chest, feeling his heartbeat. We're here. We're safe. We survived. When I heard that gunshot, saw you through the window with that knife, he shuddered. You were magnificent, terrifying, but magnificent. She laughed shakily. I was terrified. Courage isn't about not being scared, he said. It's about acting despite the fear. You've got more courage than any woman I've known. Just any woman, she teased, needing lightness after darkness. Any person, he amended, kissing her softly. My warrior wife. In the following days, word spread through the county about the failed robbery. Ranchers who'd barely acknowledged them before stopped by to shake John's hand and nod respectfully to Delilah. Even some of the church ladies seemed to reassess their opinion of the barren mail-order bride who'd fought off outlaws. But more importantly, something had shifted within Delilah herself. She'd been tested by violence and hadn't shattered. She'd protected what was hers, not just the physical ranch, but the life they'd built, the love they'd found, the future they'd dared to imagine. A week later, she woke to nausea that had nothing to do with fear. As she rushed to the wash basin, a possibility she'd been afraid to voice suddenly seemed less impossible. But she kept her suspicions quiet, not wanting to burden John with hope that might prove false. Instead, she threw herself into the ranch work with renewed energy. The rains had brought the land back to life, and she was determined to make the most of it. She helped John repair fences, learned to doctor sick calves, even convinced Agnes to teach her the old woman's secret recipes. You're different, Agnes observed one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. Stronger. We all are. Delilah replied, This land demands it. Agnes studied her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. It's more than that. You've got a glow about you, like my daughter-in-law Sarah had when she was carrying my first grandchild. Delilah's hand stilled on the bread dough. It's too soon to know. Maybe, Agnes agreed. But hope isn't foolish when it's got foundation. And you, my dear, have built yourself a mighty strong foundation. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert and the first stars appeared, Delilah stood on the porch watching John work with the horses. He moved with easy grace. No longer the broken man she'd met months ago. They'd both been remade by this harsh land and by each other. Thank you, she whispered to the vast sky, to whatever force had brought her here, to this place where barren ground had learned to bloom again. The morning sickness confirmed what Delilah had scarcely dared to hope. She knelt by the wash basin, trembling not from nausea but from the impossible, made real. After years of being told her womb was barren ground, life stirred within her like spring water breaking through stone. For 3 days she kept the secret, walking through her chores in a daze of wonder and terror. She watched John at dinner, memorizing the way lamplight caught in his hair, imagining how his face would change when she told him. But fear held her tongue. What if she was wrong? What if her body betrayed her again? It was Agnes who forced the truth into the open. The old woman cornered her in the garden where Delilah was lost in thought, absently pulling weeds. When are you going to tell him? Agnes asked without preamble. Tell him what? But the pretense was weak, and they both knew it. Agnes snorted. Girl, I've birthed 4 babies and helped deliver a dozen more. I know the look. The way you're holding your stomach when you think no one's watching. The green tinge when you smell bacon cooking. How far along? 2 months, maybe 3. The words emerged as barely a whisper. I can't. What if I'm wrong? And what if you're not? Agnes lowered herself onto the garden bench with a grunt. Delilah, I've watched that boy of mine come back to life since you arrived. Don't you think he deserves to share this joy, even if it doesn't last? That evening, as they sat on the porch watching thunderheads build over the mountains, Delilah gathered her courage. John was talking about the fall harvest, planning improvements to the ranch, his voice warm with contentment. She placed her hand over his, stilling his words. John, her throat felt tight. I need to tell you something. He turned to her, instantly alert to the tremor in her voice. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think. I hope. She took a shaky breath. I'm with child. The words hung between them like stars suddenly made visible. John's face went through a series of transformations, shock, disbelief, something that might have been terror, and then breaking like sun through storm clouds. Joy so profound it took her breath away. He couldn't finish, his voice cracking like a boy's. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before. She couldn't continue because John had pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass and steel at once, precious and strong. But they said, your husband said, he was wrong, Delilah said firmly. They were all wrong. Sometimes bodies just need the right season to bloom. John pulled back to study her face, his hands framing her cheeks. Are you well? Do you need anything? Should you be resting? I'll hire more help. You shouldn't be working so hard. John! She laughed through tears she hadn't realized were falling. I'm pregnant, not dying. Women have been doing this since Eve. Not you, he said fiercely. You're not any woman. You're my wife, my miracle. The news transformed the ranch as surely as rain transformed the desert. John became almost comically protective, trying to prevent Delilah from lifting anything heavier than a teacup. Agnes appointed herself guardian of ancient wisdom, brewing teas and tonics, sharing advice accumulated over decades. Even Miguel, usually taciturn, whistled while he worked and carved a small wooden horse in the evenings. For the little one, he said shyly. Word spread as word always did in small communities. The reaction was mixed. Some celebrated with genuine warmth. Others whispered skepticism. Constance Weatherby made a point of loudly wondering if the child was truly John's, earning herself a tongue-lashing from Agnes that became legend in 3 counties. Bitter old crow. Agnes spat after encountering Constance at the general store. Some people can't stand to see others' joy. Makes their own misery too obvious. But Delilah found she no longer cared about the gossip. Her world had shrunk to the life growing within her. The man who talked to her belly each night, and the family they'd cobbled together from loss and love. The pregnancy wasn't easy. The heat of summer made her miserable. Her ankles swelled, and there were days when fear crept in like fog. She remembered her former husband's accusations. The doctors who'd proclaimed her defective. What if something went wrong? What if the baby... During one particularly difficult night, when the baby hadn't moved for hours and panic clawed at her throat, John held her in the darkness. Tell me about our child, he said softly. Boy or girl? I don't know, she whispered. Guess, dream. Tell me who they'll be. So she did. She painted pictures with words, a daughter with John's steady heart and her determination, a son with her curiosity and his strength. They built an imaginary child out of hopes and wishes. And somewhere in the telling, the baby stirred, pressing against her palm like a greeting. The town slowly adjusted to the miracle. Dr. Morrison, who'd initially been skeptical, became her fierce advocate after each successful examination. "Strong heartbeat," he'd announce. "Growing well. Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Thorne, keep doing it." Even some of the church ladies softened, bringing baby clothes and advice. Sarah McKinnon, who'd lost 2 babies herself, pressed a tiny knitted blanket into Delilah's hands with tears in her eyes. "For hope," she said simply. As autumn arrived and Delilah's body grew round with promise, the ranch thrived. The harvest exceeded expectations, the cattle were healthy, and John walked with a lightness she'd never seen. He'd build furniture in the evenings, a cradle, a rocking chair, tiny shelves for a nursery, his hands creating a future they'd once thought impossible. One night, as they lay in bed with John's hands spread over her belly, feeling the baby's acrobatics, Delilah voiced the fear she'd kept buried. "What if they were right before? What if I can't—" "Stop," John said gently. "You are the strongest woman I know. You've already done the impossible. You've made this ranch a home, brought my mother joy in her final years, taught me to love again. This baby is just one more miracle in a string of them." "Your mother's not in her final years," Delilah protested. "She's too ornery to die." They both laughed. But the truth was, Agnes had grown frailer. The fever had taken more than they'd initially realized. And now she spent most days in her chair, conserving strength. But her eyes remained sharp, especially when watching Delilah's growing belly. "I'll live to see my grandchild," Agnes declared one afternoon. "Already decided, the Lord and I have an understanding." As winter approached and Delilah entered her final months, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. The baby dropped lower, making breathing difficult but movement easier. Delilah nested frantically, preparing everything twice over. John hardly left her side, abandoning all but essential ranch work to Miguel's capable hands. The first snow began to fall when the pain started, weeks earlier than expected. Delilah woke in the pre-dawn darkness to a cramping that stole her breath. When she reached for John, her hand came away wet with blood. "No," she whispered, terror flooding through her. "Not yet, not now." John woke instantly, saw the blood, and his face went white, but his voice remained calm. "I'll get the doctor. Miguel will stay with you and Mother." "John," fear made her voice small. "What if—" He kissed her hard, quick. "You listen to me, Delilah Moore Thorne. You're going to be fine. Our baby is going to be fine. You're both fighters, and fighters don't quit." As he rode into the swirling snow, Delilah gripped Agnes's hand and prayed to every power she could name that John was right. The baby moved within her, strong despite coming early, and she held on to that movement like a promise. "Almost there," Agnes soothed, though her own face was etched with worry. "Just a little longer. Dear girl, you've come too far to stop now." Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the desert in white, transforming the harsh landscape into something soft and new. Inside, Delilah labored toward an uncertain dawn, carrying the hopes of a barren woman made fertile, a bitter man made tender, and a love that had bloomed despite every odd against it. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping them in a world of white silence broken only by Delilah's laboring cries. Dr. Morrison had arrived just as the roads became impassable, his medical bag clutched like salvation itself. Now he worked with grim efficiency while the wind howled its own birth pains against the walls. "Too early," he muttered, but his hands remained steady. "The baby's positioned well, but small. Mrs. Thorne, you must stay strong." Delilah had passed beyond words. The pain came in waves that threatened to pull her under, each more intense than the last. She gripped John's hand hard enough to leave bruises, drawing strength from his presence. His face was haggard with fear, but his voice never wavered as he whispered encouragement. Promises, prayers. Agnes sat in the corner, too weak to help but refusing to leave. She clutched her Bible and spoke to God with the familiarity of old adversaries. "You've taken enough from this family," she informed the Almighty. "This one lives. Both of them. You hear me?" Hours blended into eternity. The lamp oil ran low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock their vigil. Delilah felt herself fragmenting, splitting between the woman fighting to bring life into the world and some distant observer watching it all with detached wonder. Is this how Martha felt? The thought came unbidden, bringing fresh terror. "No," John said firmly, as if reading her mind. "You're not her. This is not that. Stay with me. Delilah, stay here." The final stage came with the dawn, pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Delilah found reserves she didn't know existed, some primal strength that connected her to every woman who had ever fought this battle. She bore down with everything she had, John supporting her shoulders, the doctor guiding, Agnes praying. And then, cutting through the storm's fury and her own exhaustion, came a sound that rewrote the world, a baby's cry, thin but fierce, announcing arrival against all odds. "A girl," Dr. Morrison announced, his professional mask slipping to reveal wonder. "Small but perfect. Listen to those lungs." John was crying openly as he took his daughter, his large hands cradling her tiny form with infinite gentleness. She was indeed small, fitting easily in his palms, but her face was perfectly formed, crowned with dark hair like her mother's. Her cries quieted as he held her, dark eyes blinking up at him with ancient wisdom. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa. I've been waiting for you." He placed her on Delilah's chest, and the world contracted to just this, skin against skin, heartbeat to heartbeat, the miracle of life where none was expected. Delilah touched her daughter's cheek with trembling fingers, counting toes and fingers, marveling at the impossible made real. "She's beautiful," she breathed. "John, we made her. We actually—" "You did it!" he said fiercely, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, tasting salt and joy. "You brilliant, brave, miraculous woman. You did it!" Agnes hobbled over. Agnes, who had seemed too frail to survive the winter, now glowing with grandmotherly pride. "What will you call her?" Delilah and John looked at each other, a whole conversation in a glance. They had discussed names for months, but now only one seemed right. "Hope," Delilah said softly. "Hope Agnes Thorne, for the future, and for the woman who helped us find it." Agnes's weathered face crumpled. That's a fine name indeed." She touched the baby's head with one gnarled finger. A benediction. "Welcome to the world. Little Hope, you've got a lot of living to do." The storm broke that afternoon, revealing a world transformed. Snow blanketed the harsh landscape, softening edges, covering scars, making everything new. Word spread despite the weather. The barren woman had borne a child. The grieving widower had found joy. The mail-order bride had brought life to a dying ranch. They came despite the snow, or perhaps because of it. Miguel was first, hat in hand, eyes bright with tears as he presented the carved horse. "For when she's older," he said gruffly. Then came neighbors with food and firewood, understanding that new life demanded celebration even in hardship. Sarah McKinnon arrived with her husband, bringing practical gifts: cloth diapers, tiny gowns, a feeding bottle in case it was needed. She held Hope with experienced hands while tears tracked down her cheeks. "She's perfect," she whispered. "Just perfect." Even some who had been cruel came, humbled by the miracle. Not Constance Weatherby. Some hearts were too small for such grace, but others who had whispered and judged now brought offerings of reconciliation. Delilah accepted all with weary grace, too exhausted and happy to hold grudges. Dr. Morrison stayed 3 days, monitoring mother and child. Hope, despite her early arrival and small size, thrived with the determination of desert wildflowers. She nursed strongly, slept peacefully, and gazed at the world with those knowing eyes that seemed to say, "I was always meant to be here." Spring came early that year, as if the earth itself celebrated new beginnings. The ranch flourished with an abundance that seemed miraculous after the drought. Calves were born healthy, crops grew thick, and water ran clear and plentiful. John added rooms to the house, planning for more children with the confidence of a man who had learned that some ground just needs time to prove fertile. Agnes lived to see Hope take her first steps, toddling between grandmother and parents with delighted squeals. The old woman died peacefully in her sleep the following winter, having kept her bargain with God. They buried her on the hill overlooking the ranch, where she could watch over the land that had been both cruel and kind. She was ready, Delilah said softly, holding Hope at the graveside. She told me she'd seen everything she needed to see. As years passed, more children followed. Thomas sturdy and thoughtful like his father. Clara, quick and determined like her mother. Baby James, who arrived as easily as Hope had come hard. The ranch house rang with laughter, arguments, life in all its messy glory. Delilah stood on the porch one evening, watching John teach Hope to ride. At 6, their daughter sat tall in the saddle, fearless and free. Thomas played in the dirt nearby while Clara napped in the cradle Agnes had used for her own babies. James grew within her, a familiar flutter of promise. Charles's letter had arrived last month, asking for forgiveness, saying he'd been wrong. She'd burned it without response. That life belonged to another woman, one who had believed herself broken. This Delilah, mother, wife, rancher, knew better. Sometimes the richest soil was that which had been called barren by those who didn't understand seasons of the heart. "Mama, watch!" Hope called, urging her pony to a trot. "I'm watching," Delilah called back, her hand resting on her swelling belly. "I'm always watching." John caught her eye and smiled. That private smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. He'd kept his promise. Her life with him had been better than anything she'd dared imagine when she'd stepped off that stagecoach, a discarded woman looking for a place to hide. Instead, she'd found a place to bloom. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the desert, coyotes began their evening song. The ranch settled into peaceful twilight, and Delilah Moore Thorne, mother of 4, beloved wife, desert rose, smiled at the abundance of her life. In the distance, thunder rumbled, promising rain. The earth waited, ready to receive it, knowing now that even the driest ground could yield miracles with patience, love, and hope. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale of love blooming in the harsh beauty of the Wild West. Where are you listening to this story from? We'd love to hear from listeners around the world. Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reflections help keep the spirit of the frontier alive. Until next time, partners, may your own trails lead to unexpected blessings.